The Atlantic was a cold, endless expanse, a living graveyard stretched beneath a gray sky. In 1944, it was still the most dangerous place on Earth. Beneath those shifting waves lurked steel predators, German U-boats, hunting in silence for convoys that fed the Allied war machine. The men inside them were pale, sleepless, and young. They called themselves the Grey Wolves, proud disciples of Admiral Karl Dönitz, who believed that a handful of submarines could strangle entire nations. For years, they nearly did. Ships vanished in fire and oil slicks. The sea was littered with drifting wreckage and unanswered cries. But by late 1944, the tide had turned. The hunter was becoming the hunted. Each dive, each patrol had begun to feel like a death sentence. The new Allied sonar could hear them breathe. Radar planes prowled the clouds above. Destroyers carried depth charges that could reach deep and crush a submarine's hull like a tin can. Inside those cramped steel coffins, 50 men lived shoulder to shoulder, inhaling diesel fumes, sweat, and fear. The lights flickered constantly. The air grew foul within days. Every sound from the hull could be the ocean trying to kill them. Yet they kept going because orders said they must. The U-boat service had the highest fatality rate in the entire German military. Most crews never saw home again. One late afternoon in the North Atlantic, a U-boat, let's call her U-870, was running low on fuel and luck. Her commander, Kapitän Leutnant Karl Fischer, was only 27 but looked 40. He had been at sea since 1941, a veteran of convoys, storms, and narrow escapes. His men trusted him absolutely. They also knew that this patrol might be their last. The radio crackled with bad news. Other boats had vanished. Bases in France were lost. The Reich itself was shrinking. Fischer stared at the horizon through the periscope and saw only endless gray. Above them, Allied hunter-killer groups roamed the ocean like wolves of their own. That evening, as the crew prepared to dive again, the sonar operator froze. "Propellers," he whispered. "Multiple contacts. Fast." Fischer's heart sank. He ordered silent running. The men held their breath. The low hum of engines passed overhead, and then the first pattern of depth charges exploded. The boat shuddered violently, lights dimming to red. Dust and paint chips rained from the ceiling. Someone crossed himself. Another set of explosions followed, closer this time. The sound was not like thunder. It was like the earth itself splitting apart. Fischer knew the Americans had found them. For the next hour, the U-boat twisted and turned through the dark, dropping deeper, changing course, trying to escape the sonar pings that seemed to follow them everywhere. The depth gauge needle trembled past 200 meters. Pipes groaned. One seal began to leak, spraying a fine mist of seawater that glittered in the red light. "Hold her steady," Fischer said quietly, gripping. The periscope handles, though, he couldn't see a thing. His men obeyed without speaking. Another explosion rolled through the hull. Somewhere aft, a light went out. When silence finally returned, they could hear their own hearts beating. Fischer ordered the boat to rise slowly, hoping to slip away. But the sonar pings came again, closer, sharper. The enemy was patient. The next volley of depth charges hit the stern directly. The boat lurched sideways, alarms blaring, power flickered and died. Men tumbled across the floor. The engineer shouted that the ballast tanks were damaged. Seawater poured in. Fischer knew they couldn't survive another run. "Prepare to surface," he said. The words tasted like ash. When the U-boat broke through the surface, it was night, but the horizon glowed with searchlights. Shells splashed around them as the American destroyers fired warning bursts. Fischer shouted for the men to abandon ship. They spilled out onto the deck, dazed, coughing, some wounded from flying metal. The Atlantic air cut through their wet clothes like knives. In minutes, the submarine that had carried them through years of war began to die. Fischer opened the valves to scuttle her. The water rushed in, gurgling and hissing until the bow tilted down. He watched the gray hull slide beneath the waves one final time and whispered, "Gute Nacht." The Americans ceased fire once the men were in the water. Through binoculars, the commander of the destroyer saw dozens of figures bobbing amid debris, their orange life jackets faint in the darkness. "They're surrendering," he said. His name was Captain James Harland, a man with 30 years of service and eyes that had seen too much death. His crew waited for orders. He could have left the Germans to the freezing sea. No one would have blamed him. But Harlan turned to his men and said, "Get them out of there." Searchlights swept the waves as small boats were lowered. Sailors pulled the shivering Germans from the water, one by one, wrapping them in blankets, hauling them aboard. Some were half-conscious, their lips blue, their hands clawed and stiff. A young American medic checked pulses, shouting for coffee and dry clothes. The prisoners stared in disbelief. They had expected mockery, maybe a bullet. Instead, they were being helped, even comforted. One German collapsed on the deck, muttering, "You are not supposed to do this." The medic didn't answer. He just lifted the man's head and poured warm coffee between his cracked lips. When all survivors were aboard, Captain Harlan stood on deck watching his crew tend to them. "Make sure they're all accounted for," he said. His executive officer hesitated. "Sir, they were killing our boys out there." Harlan's face didn't change. They were sailors, same as us. The sea's punishment enough. Then he walked among the prisoners himself, nodding to each group. The Germans shrank away at first, expecting interrogation. Instead, Harlan told them in slow, clear words, "You fought bravely. You're safe now. You'll be treated as prisoners of war, not animals." For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the wind and the slap of waves against the hull. Then one of the younger Germans, barely 18, whispered to another, "They are kind." The American who heard it pretended not to understand, but the words stayed with him. That night, the crew of the destroyer shared their rations with the captured men. Someone produced cigarettes, others brought soup from the galley. The Germans, trembling and exhausted, accepted in silence. Some began to cry quietly. They had lived in terror of drowning, of being hunted like beasts, and now the hunters were offering them mercy. Below deck, the smell of coffee and diesel mingled. A German petty officer with frostbitten hands stared at the blanket wrapped around him, murmuring that it smelled of soap. "They even washed it," he said, as if that were the strangest thing in the world. In his mind, Americans were brutal machines of war, faceless and merciless. Yet these men laughed softly, spoke kindly, and treated him with care. When Harlan came below to check on the wounded, the Germans fell silent. He stopped beside one stretcher where a sailor with shrapnel wounds was grimacing in pain. "Easy now," Harlan said to the medic, then to the wounded man. "You'll be all right, son." The translator repeated the words, and the German's eyes widened. No officer in his own navy had ever called him son. Harlan turned to leave, but one of the prisoners spoke up. "Why?" he asked in broken English. "Why help us?" The captain paused. "Because we're sailors," he said simply, "and sailors don't let each other drown." That night, as the destroyer steamed toward port with its strange cargo of enemies and survivors, the crew noticed something odd. The prisoners slept peacefully. Even the youngest ones, who had trembled in fear hours earlier, now lay still. Above them, the stars were clear and cold. The war raged on elsewhere, but on that ship, for a few brief hours, there was quiet understanding. The next morning dawned pale and misty, the horizon smudged by fog and smoke. The destroyer cut through the waves with slow dignity, its decks slick with salt spray. The German prisoners were gathered under watch on the aft deck, wrapped in American blankets, sipping tin cups of coffee. They sat silently, staring at the rising sun as if it were the first they'd seen in years. Captain Harlan stood nearby, coat buttoned to his chin, hands clasped behind his back. His officers expected hostility or arrogance from the captives, but instead they found only exhaustion, a kind of hollow surrender that went deeper than fear. These were not the confident predators of Nazi propaganda. They were just men who had spent too long in the dark. Harlan studied them quietly. Most were barely out of their teens. Their uniforms were soaked and torn, salt crusted into the fabric. One of them, a boy with pale eyes and trembling hands, kept glancing toward the sea where his U-boat had vanished. "She's gone," he murmured in German. "All gone." The translator hesitated before repeating the words, but Harlan nodded anyway, understanding even without them. "Yes," he said softly. "The war takes everything." Then he motioned to the mess crew to bring more food. "They've had enough salt water for one lifetime." As the morning wore on, the Americans began to see their prisoners differently. The first shock of battle had faded, replaced by a strange respect. The Germans, for their part, couldn't reconcile what they saw. They had been told the Americans were monsters, that capture meant humiliation, or worse. But now the same hands that had dropped the depth charges were handing them bread and coffee. One German sailor, his head bandaged from a flying fragment, tried to refuse food, muttering that he hadn't earned it. The American mess steward just smiled and pushed the tray toward him. "You earned it by still breathing," he said. When Harland went below to write his report, his first officer followed, still uneasy. "Sir, permission to speak freely?" he asked. Harland nodded. "We shouldn't be coddling them," the officer said. "Those men have sent hundreds of our boys to the bottom." Harland set his pen down and looked up. "Yes, and every one of our boys died, knowing what it meant to fight with honor. If we forget that now, we're no better than the ones who started this war." The younger man hesitated, then saluted, and left. Harland returned to his writing, noting in his log that all prisoners were accounted for and receiving humane treatment. But privately, in a line meant for no report, he added, "We may win more by mercy than by hate." By noon, the weather worsened. The wind rose and the sea turned rough, tossing spray over the deck. The Germans huddled together for warmth while the Americans lashed down loose equipment. When one of the prisoners began to shiver uncontrollably, a sailor named Donovan pulled off his own coat and draped it over the man's shoulders. "Don't want you dying before the paperwork's done," he joked. The German stared at him, half smiling, then whispered, "Danke." Donovan only shrugged. "Don't mention it, Fritz." That small act spread quietly through both groups. The next time the galley sent up coffee, several Americans carried extra cups aft without being asked. As night fell again, Harland gathered a few of his men in the wardroom. The chart table was littered with maps and grease pencils, but no one spoke of tactics. Instead, they talked about what they'd seen, the faces of their prisoners, the way they looked more lost than dangerous. Harland listened, then said, "Men, war doesn't erase the sea's rules. Out there you help a sailor in distress. No matter what flag he flies, remember that. One day, this'll all be over, and how we behaved will matter more than how many ships we sank." In the cramped compartment below, the German crew whispered among themselves. Their commander, Fischer, lay on a cot with a bruised rib and a swollen eye. He watched his men slowly relax, the terror fading from their faces. "They treat us like guests," one sailor whispered. "Why?" another replied bitterly. "Maybe they want us to talk." Fischer shook his head. "No, this isn't an interrogation. This is something else." He struggled to sit up, wincing. "They're showing us what we were never shown. Respect." His words hung in the air. For a moment, even the youngest crewman seemed older. Later, when Harland visited the hold, he found Fischer awake. The translator stepped forward, but the captain waved him aside. "You speak English?" Harland asked. Fischer nodded slowly. "Enough." Harland crouched beside his cot. "You fought well. You kept your boat together longer than most." Fischer gave a faint smile. "We were lucky. Until we were not." His voice was hoarse, worn by diesel and salt. Harland studied him, seeing not an enemy but another captain who had carried the same burdens. The lives of his men, the impossible orders, the endless ocean. "You did your duty," Harland said quietly. "That's all a man can do." Fischer looked at him for a long time. "And you?" he asked. "Why do you save us?" Harland stood, his coat brushing the deck. "Because the sea takes enough lives. It doesn't need our help." That night the engines hummed steadily as the destroyer pushed through rolling waves. Most of the prisoners slept, but a few sat awake, listening to the steady rhythm of the ship. It was a sound they knew well, the heartbeat of the ocean, the same on every vessel. One young German turned to another and whispered, "Do you think they'll hate us forever?" The other shook his head. "Not if they're like their captain." In another corner, an American sentry overheard and smiled faintly, pretending he hadn't. By the third day, they reached the convoy's rendezvous point. The sea was calm again, the sky wide and blue. A supply ship came alongside to transfer provisions and news. The Allies had captured more ground in France. The war was still raging, but victory was no longer a question of if, only when. The Germans listened to the rumors with quiet resignation. Fisher stared at the horizon, where a faint line of sunlight glimmered on the waves. "It's almost over," he said. One of his men replied softly, "But we lived." For the first time, Fisher smiled. "Yes," he said, "we lived." That evening, as the sun sank behind the sea, Captain Harlan stood on deck beside Fisher. The air smelled of salt and smoke, and gulls wheeled in the distance. Neither man spoke for a while. Finally, Fisher said, "In my country, they tell us Americans are cold, that you fight like machines." Harlan chuckled. "Machines don't rescue their enemies from the ocean." Fisher looked down, his eyes reflecting the dying light. "Then they are wrong." He hesitated, then added, "I will tell them that if I live long enough." Harlan extended his hand. After a pause, Fisher took it. The handshake was brief, firm, and wordless. Two sailors acknowledging each other's humanity in a world gone mad. When the destroyer reached port, the prisoners were prepared for transfer. Marines lined the deck, rifles slung, but the mood was strangely quiet. As the Germans were led away, one of them turned and saluted the American flag flying over the stern. Harlan returned the gesture without hesitation. "Safe voyage, boys," he called. The interpreter frowned. "Sir, they're prisoners." Harlan nodded. "Not anymore. They're survivors." The Germans disappeared down the gangway, leaving behind only wet footprints and silence. That night, the captain's log contained a final note about the incident. Rescued 42 survivors from enemy submarine, all treated with full honors of the sea. Then beneath it, a personal line. "In the end, mercy is the last weapon worth drawing." A few days later, the warship resumed her regular patrols through the gray expanse of the North Atlantic, though the mood aboard had changed. The crew spoke less of sinking enemies and more of the faces they had seen. Some even wondered aloud what had become of those Germans after they left port. If they were sent to camps, if they would survive the war, if they would ever see home again. For men who had spent months hunting submarines, it was strange to think of their opponents as human beings. But the image of frostbitten hands clutching steaming mugs of coffee lingered in their minds. Captain Harlan noticed it too. There was less anger among his men, less of the blind hatred that had once made killing easier. War hadn't softened them, nothing could, but it had given them clarity. They understood now that the enemy was often just another sailor doing what duty demanded. Late one evening, Harlan stood on the bridge alone, watching the horizon fade into fog. The ocean was calm again, deceptively peaceful. He thought of the U-boat commander, of his steady gaze and his quiet dignity. There was something noble in the way the man had faced defeat. Harlan wondered if, in another life, they might have been friends. Two captains trading stories over a bottle instead of trying to destroy each other. Down in the mess, the sailors joked quietly as they ate. Donovan, the one who'd given his coat to a German prisoner, told a new recruit about it. "Kid looked like he hadn't eaten in weeks," he said. "Could barely hold a spoon. You should have seen his face when we handed him a blanket, like we'd handed him his mother." The recruit shook his head, half smiling. "You're soft, Don." Donovan shrugged. "Maybe, but I'd rather be soft than heartless." Another sailor nodded. "Captain says we're sailors first, warriors second. Maybe that's how it's supposed to be." As the days turned into weeks, the destroyer's patrol log filled with coordinates and uneventful entries. The great submarine threat was fading. Allied dominance in the air and sea was nearly absolute. Yet the memory of that one encounter would not fade. When the crew docked at an American port for refueling, word of the rescue had already reached the higher command. Harlan received an official commendation for the successful engagement and capture, though he cared little for the praise. What stayed with him were the small gestures. The boys whispered, "Danke," the handshake on the deck, the moment when compassion had replaced combat. In the months that followed, as Germany's defeat became certain, Harlan's destroyer escorted convoys across calmer seas. News came that the captured submarine, U-505, had been studied for intelligence and preserved for display. The papers hailed it as a triumph of naval skill, But those who'd been there knew the real story was not about machinery or codebooks. It was about men who had refused to surrender their humanity when it would have been easier to hate. Harlan never spoke publicly of it. When asked by a reporter, he merely said, "We did what sailors do." Far away in a prisoner of war camp in the United States, Carl Fisher and his surviving crew adjusted to a new rhythm of life. The camp was fenced and guarded, but compared to the claustrophobic terror of a U-boat, it felt almost open. They had beds, warm meals, clean clothes. Some even attended classes offered by the Red Cross, English lessons, mechanics, history. The guards treated them fairly, and the camp commander visited often to ensure conditions remained humane. Fisher, though still haunted by the loss of his ship and men, carried himself with quiet gratitude. He remembered the American captain's words, "The sea takes enough lives. It doesn't need our help." On cold nights, the prisoners gathered in small groups, talking softly about the war. Many still couldn't believe the way they had been treated. One of the youngest sailors said, "They fed us, clothed us, saved us. My father said Americans had no honor. He was wrong." Fisher nodded. "Honor is not owned by nations," he said. "It belongs to men who choose it." He wrote those words in a small notebook he kept hidden under his pillow, determined to remember them when the war ended. Back aboard Harlan's ship, the crew received letters from home, wives, children, friends eager for news of peace. The war in Europe was nearly over. Japan would soon follow. When the announcement finally came, the destroyer was docked in Boston Harbor. Whistles blew, flags waved, and crowds cheered. But Harlan didn't join the celebrations. He stood by the rail, watching gulls circle over the water. For him, victory was complicated. He had seen too many faces, American and German alike, staring up from the sea. He thought again of Fisher's words, "We were lucky, until we were not." Years later, after retiring from the Navy, Harlan visited a museum in Chicago where a captured U-boat had been preserved. He walked slowly around the massive gray hull, running his hand along the cold metal. The guide spoke about the engineering, the Enigma machines, the daring capture. Harlan barely listened. He was remembering the night sky over the Atlantic, the freezing water, the desperate voices calling for help. He could almost hear the clang of the rescue lines and the hiss of steam from the ship's engines. When the tour ended, he lingered near the railing, gazing up at the submarine's conning tower. A plaque nearby read, "Captured with Honor, June 4th, 1944. He smiled faintly. "Honor," he whispered. "That's what it was." Meanwhile, across the ocean, Fisher too had survived the war. Released from captivity in 1946, he returned to a shattered Germany. Cities were in ruins, the Navy disbanded, the seas silent. He found work repairing boats on the Rhine, content to stay near the water that had both cursed and saved him. He married, raised a family, and rarely spoke of the war. But sometimes, when the sun set over the river, he told his sons about the Americans who had pulled him from the Atlantic. "They treated us like men," he said, "not enemies. Men." His children would listen wide-eyed, unable to imagine kindness in the middle of such destruction. One winter, decades later, Fisher received a letter written in careful English. It was from a veterans association in the United States, inviting former sailors from both sides to a reunion marking the anniversary of the U-505's capture. At first, he hesitated. The past was heavy and his English was poor, but his wife urged him to go. "You owe them thanks," she said. So, in the spring of 1974, Carl Fisher, now gray-haired and stooped, boarded a flight to America. When he arrived at the museum, he found the submarine exactly as he remembered it, gray, weathered, silent. There were Americans there, old sailors in uniform jackets, their medals glinting in the sun. Among them stood a tall man with a cane and piercing blue eyes. Fisher recognized him instantly, even after 30 years. "Captain Harlan?" he asked. The American turned, then smiled. "Commander Fisher, you made it." They shook hands again, older, slower, but with the same unspoken respect as before. For a long time, neither said anything. The noise of the crowd faded around them. Finally, Fisher said, "I told my sons about you. They didn't believe it. They said no enemy would show mercy. Harlan chuckled. Then you'll have to tell them again. Maybe they'll believe an old man. As the day ended, the two men stood side by side, looking at the submarine's open hatch. She's smaller than I remember, Harlan said. Fisher nodded. Everything from that time feels smaller now, except the sea. Harlan smiled. The sea never changes. They said goodbye at sunset, knowing they would never meet again. Fisher returned to Germany. Harlan passed away a few years later. But their brief friendship, born from a single act of compassion in the midst of war, endured in the memories of all who heard it. In the years that followed their meeting in Chicago, the story of the captured submarine and the strange friendship between its commanders began to circulate quietly among naval historians and veterans groups. It wasn't the kind of tale that appeared in official war records or victory parades. There were no grand speeches or medals awarded for kindness, but those who heard it recognized that it carried something far rarer than glory. It was a fragment of decency salvaged from one of humanity's darkest storms. Carl Fisher returned home to his small town on the Rhine with a collection of photographs from that reunion, pictures of the U-boat displayed under bright American skies, of gray-haired men in uniform laughing together. He hung one in his workshop, the image of himself standing beside Captain Harlan, both men smiling faintly. Visitors often asked about it, and Fisher would tell them the story, not to boast, but to remind them that mercy had existed even then. This man, he would say, tapping the photo, taught me that honor can live on both sides of a war. The years softened the sharp edges of memory, but certain details never left him. The taste of salt in the air as the destroyer approached, the blinding searchlights, the strong hands that pulled him from the freezing sea. He could still hear Harlan's voice saying, "Because the sea takes enough lives." It became something he repeated to himself whenever life felt cruel or senseless. His sons and grandchildren grew up with the tale as a kind of family legend, how their father had survived not through luck or skill, but through the compassion of an enemy. Across the ocean, the same story lived in the recollections of Harlan's crew. At reunions, sailors would speak of that night as if it had happened yesterday. Donovan, the sailor who'd given his coat away, loved telling the story to anyone who would listen. "We just blasted that sub to pieces," he'd say, "and an hour later we were hauling those poor devils out of the water like brothers. Captain wouldn't have it any other way." Someone would always ask if he ever regretted saving them, and Donovan's answer never changed. "Not once. You don't let a man drown when you can pull him in. That's the rule, and it don't change with flags." When Harlan died in 1980, the Navy honored him with a quiet ceremony. His coffin was draped in the flag, and among the flowers on the casket lay a small silver compass, sent from Germany by Carl Fisher. Attached was a note written in careful English, "To the man who showed me the way home." The gesture moved Harlan's family deeply. They displayed the compass beside his medals, where it remained long after the war itself had faded into books and museums. By the 1990s, the U-5005 exhibit had become one of Chicago's most visited attractions. School children filed through its narrow corridors, marveling at the cramped bunks and dials, hearing about radar, torpedoes, and the brutal life beneath the waves. But occasionally, a guide would mention something less technical. When this boat was captured, they'd say, the American sailors rescued every man they could. They treated their prisoners with respect, even in the middle of war. The children would listen, wide-eyed, trying to imagine such a thing. Some would ask, why would they do that? And the guide would always reply, because sometimes doing the right thing matters more than winning. Fisher lived long enough to see that same spirit survive into the next generation. In his final years, he corresponded with several American veterans, exchanging letters filled with shared memories of the sea. "We were all young once," one wrote to him, "and we all thought we were fighting for the world. Maybe we were, but I think what we really fought for was each other." Fisher kept that letter folded in his pocket until the day he died. At his funeral in Germany, the local pastor read a passage from one of Fisher's notebooks. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. "War teaches men to hate, but the sea teaches them to forgive." I learned both lessons, but I remember only the second. The congregation sat in silence, listening to the rain tapping on the windows, as if the ocean itself was paying its respects. Meanwhile, somewhere in an archive, an old Navy logbook rested on a shelf. Inside, in Captain Harlan's precise handwriting, one line stood out among the official entries of coordinates and weather reports. Rescued 42 survivors from enemy submarine, all treated with full honors of the sea. It was a simple statement, yet those few words contained an entire world of meaning. A world where duty met decency, where courage was measured not by destruction but by compassion. Decades later, long after both men were gone, a historian writing about the Battle of the Atlantic stumbled upon that logbook. Curious, he began to trace the story behind it. He found records of U-505, accounts of the capture, and a few brief mentions of the humane treatment of prisoners. But what fascinated him most was the absence of bitterness in every survivor's account. The Germans never spoke of humiliation, only disbelief and gratitude. The Americans never spoke of hatred, only respect. It was as if, for a single fleeting moment, the madness of the war had paused, allowing something human to surface. When the historian's article was published, veterans from both sides wrote letters of thanks. Some had served on other ships, others had been prisoners themselves. One wrote simply, "It's good to know that even in the darkest times, someone remembered to be kind." Another letter came from Fisher's eldest son, now an old man himself. He enclosed a copy of the photograph from the reunion, Harland and Fisher standing side by side, and added a short message. "My father said that kindness at sea is like light underwater. It doesn't reach far, but it never goes out." The story spread quietly, retold in documentaries and history forums, but it was never sensationalized. It didn't need to be. Its power lay in its simplicity. Two men, enemies by order, had recognized each other's humanity in the cold Atlantic and carried that understanding for the rest of their lives. Each time someone stood beneath the towering hull of U-505 and read the plaque, "Captured with Honor," they were reading not just a historical note, but a moral testament. For many visitors, it was easy to walk away thinking of the bravery of sailors, the strategy, the machines. But for those who paused long enough to reflect, there was a deeper message in the silence of that steel vessel. The submarine was a relic of war, but it also embodied a moment of peace, the instant when compassion triumphed over vengeance. And in that way, it still lived. When the lights dim at the museum each evening and the last echoes of footsteps fade, the submarine sits quietly in the dark. Perhaps, if one listens closely, one could imagine the faint hum of engines, the creak of the hull, and distant voices in two languages calling out across the water. Voices not of hatred, but of survival. Voices of men who learned in the cold heart of the Atlantic that mercy can be as powerful as any weapon. The Atlantic itself seemed to carry their memory. To sailors crossing those waters long after the war, there was a superstition whispered in quiet tones that somewhere between the coordinates where the U-boat had gone down and the place where the destroyer had halted to save its crew, the sea was calmer, gentler. Veterans said that even the waves there seemed to hesitate, as if paying tribute to what had happened. Mariners who knew the story called it the Mercy Patch. They didn't believe in ghosts, not really, but they believed that the ocean remembered everything, the screams, the explosions, and the rare acts of grace that rose above it all. Decades passed, but the war never entirely vanished. It lived on in rusting ships at the bottom of the sea, in the faded photographs of young men who had once thought themselves invincible. In the libraries and museums that preserved their stories, people read about tonnage sunk, convoys lost, medals won. Yet buried within those statistics was something far more human, the quiet defiance of a single man who chose decency over vengeance. Captain Harlan's family kept his journals after his death. His daughter, who had been a child during the war, began transcribing them years later. She expected notes about tactics and weather, coordinates and technical details. Instead, she found entries full of reflection. In one passage, written weeks after the capture, her father had confessed, "I used to think courage was about charging forward, about never hesitating. But that night, pulling those boys from the water, I realized courage can also mean stopping the hate before it turns you into what you fight." She read those words aloud at a memorial service for veterans, her voice trembling slightly as she reached the final line. "If we can rescue even one soul from the sea or from the darkness inside us, then maybe we've already won something greater than war." When she finished, the room was silent. Men who had seen the worst of battle sat with their heads bowed, remembering the comrades they had lost and the moments of humanity that had helped them survive. In Germany, Carl Fischer's grandchildren grew up hearing the same story told from the other side. Their grandfather never spoke of the politics of the war, nor of orders or ideology. When asked why he had joined the Navy, he would shrug and say, "Because I loved the sea." He spoke instead about that night of capture, about the lights shining across the waves, the rough hands that had pulled him aboard, the strange kindness that had saved him. "It was the first time," he said, "that I understood how big the world really is." When Fisher's granddaughter became a teacher, she used that story in her classroom. Each year, when her students studied World War II, she would tell them about her grandfather's rescue. "History," she would say, "is not just about who won and who lost. It's about the moments when people decided not to be cruel." The children listened, sometimes skeptical, sometimes moved. One day a boy asked, "But weren't they enemies?" She smiled. "Yes, but they were also sailors. And sailors take care of each other. That's what makes them human." The story traveled further than anyone expected. Journalists began to rediscover it during anniversaries of the war's end. Documentaries aired footage of the U-505, showing veterans from both sides shaking hands, their faces lined but peaceful. In one interview, an aged American crewman looked into the camera and said, "People think war makes you hard. Maybe it does. But that night, we learned it can also make you softer. Softer in the ways that matter." His voice cracked as he spoke. "When I pulled that German kid out of the water, I saw my own brother's face. How could I not help him?" Another veteran, one of the German survivors, gave a simple answer when asked what surprised him most about capture. "The smell of coffee," he said, smiling faintly. "It smelled like home." That one sentence appeared in newspapers around the world, quoted again and again as proof that kindness can outlive violence. Back at the museum in Chicago, visitors began leaving small tokens near the submarine's display. Folded paper boats with names written on them, notes of gratitude to sailors, even letters addressed to the captain who showed mercy. The curators collected them in a glass case. Some were from descendants of Allied sailors, others from Germans who had never met Fisher but felt connected through his story. A few came from Japanese and British veterans as well, all saying variations of the same thing. "We remember." On anniversaries of the capture, a bell rang out over the exhibit, each chime echoing through the metal corridors. Former sailors who could still travel attended, standing together in silence as the sound faded. The younger generations didn't always understand the weight of that moment, but they could feel it. The reverence, the respect. It wasn't a celebration of victory. It was a remembrance of restraint. Sometimes, when storms rolled in over Lake Michigan, the guides would swear the submarine seemed to groan softly, as though the sea outside was calling it home. They'd laugh about it afterward, but none of them doubted that the ocean itself held the memory of that night. The Atlantic, they said, never forgets. A few years before his death, Fisher gave a speech to a group of naval cadets visiting from various countries. Standing before them in his old uniform, he spoke slowly, his accent thick but his meaning clear. "You must learn your machines, your tactics, your discipline. But also learn this: war will end someday. What remains is how you behaved. Remember the rules of the sea. If a man is drowning, you save him. It does not matter his flag, his face, or his faith. The sea knows no nations." The cadets applauded quietly. Some wiped their eyes. When he sat down, a young officer approached him afterward and said, "Sir, were you not afraid that showing mercy would make you weak?" Fisher smiled faintly. "Mercy does not make a man weak," he replied. "It proves that he is still a man." After his passing, that quote was engraved on a small plaque near his hometown dock where fishermen still worked the river. Sailors would touch it for luck before heading out. Tourists rarely noticed it, but those who did felt compelled to stop and read. The words had the simplicity of truth, born not from books, but from lived experience. And so, in a quiet, unremarkable way, the story of a sunken submarine and an American destroyer became more than a footnote in history. It became a lesson whispered across generations that even in humanity's worst moments, there can still be light It taught that respect is not weakness, that compassion can survive even when surrounded by hatred, and that sometimes the greatest victory is not over your enemy, but over the darkness inside yourself. The sea rolled on, indifferent yet eternal, erasing wrecks and washing over forgotten names. But in that one stretch of water, the so-called Mercy Patch, sailors swore the waves were still calm, as if even the ocean itself refused to disturb the peace born there. The story of that night continued to ripple outward long after the men who lived it had passed. Historians, veterans, and filmmakers returned to it again and again, trying to capture the mystery of what had happened. How, in a war built on hate and ideology, two enemies could find brotherhood in the middle of a cold and merciless sea. There were many theories. Some said it was professionalism, others said it was faith or the seaman's code. But those who truly understood knew it was something simpler, an instinct, a deep and ancient law written in every sailor's heart. When the sea takes one of your own, you don't stand by and watch. By the early 2000s, the U-505 exhibit had become a symbol not just of naval engineering, but of reconciliation. Veterans from both sides, too old now to stand for long, were wheeled down the ramp into the submarine's hull. The air smelled faintly of rust and oil. They would touch the steel walls with trembling hands, eyes closing as memories flooded back. The vibration of engines, the clang of hatches, the sound of men laughing in the dark to keep away fear. Many of them had not set foot on a submarine since the war, and the ghosts they carried were both heavy and kind. Among the visitors was a tall man with silver hair and a German accent, Fisher's grandson, now middle-aged, a naval engineer himself. He had come to see the submarine his grandfather once called home. Standing before the massive gray hull, he tried to imagine what it must have been like. The terror, the noise, the courage. But what moved him most was not the machinery. It was the plaque beside it that read, "Captured with Honor." He thought of his grandfather's stories, of the American captain's outstretched hand, and of how that single act had shaped his family's understanding of the war. He spoke softly to a guide standing nearby. "My grandfather was rescued from a submarine like this," he said. The guide smiled and pointed to a faded photograph displayed near the entrance. It showed two men shaking hands, one in a U.S. Navy uniform, the other in a German one. "Then your grandfather must have been one of these men," the guide said. The younger Fisher studied the image, tracing the lines of the faces with his eyes. "Yes," he whispered, "that's him." That evening, as the museum closed, he stayed behind a little longer, standing in front of that photograph. Around him, the lights dimmed until the room was filled with a soft, amber glow. For a moment, he imagined the sound of waves, the roll of the ship, the voice of his grandfather describing the rescue in halting English. He felt a lump in his throat, pride, sadness, gratitude all at once. Before leaving, he pressed his hand against the cold glass. "Danke," he said quietly, though he wasn't sure. To whom? The American captain, his grandfather, or the sea itself? Years later, when he told his own children the story, he began not with the war, but with that word, Danke. He told them how his grandfather had been saved by kindness, how even in battle there could be decency, and how the sea, for all its cruelty, could also witness grace. "Remember this," he said. "It doesn't take bravery to kill. It takes bravery to forgive." Back in the archives of the Naval History Department, researchers pieced together more fragments of the event. They found letters from crewmen, faded telegrams, and post-war interviews. One note, written by an American sailor who had helped pull survivors from the water, simply read, "They were boys, just like us. When I saw one crying for his mother, I stopped seeing a uniform." Another from a German officer described how, in the first minutes aboard the destroyer, he expected to be struck or mocked, only to be handed a towel and a cup of coffee. "It was not victory or defeat," he wrote. "It was something cleaner than either." That phrase, "something cleaner than either," later became the title of a book about the capture. It sold modestly, but among veterans and historians, it became a quiet favorite. Readers found in it not just a recounting of tactics or heroism, but a meditation on what it means to be human amid chaos. Reviewers called it a story about decency surviving in indecent times. One critic wrote, "We spend so much time studying how men fight, Perhaps we should study how they stopped fighting. In Germany, the book was translated and distributed to naval academies. Cadets read excerpts during ethics training, discussing the idea that honor doesn't end when a battle is won. In the United States, it became required reading for officer candidates in naval leadership programs. A retired admiral once held up the book during a graduation ceremony and said, "If you remember only one thing from your training, remember this. When victory tempts you to arrogance, choose compassion instead." The legacy of that long-ago night continued to ripple outward in unexpected ways. Every few years, descendants from both sides met at the museum to mark the anniversary. They came not as Americans or Germans, but as families bound by one shared truth, that kindness could cross even the deepest divide. They brought flowers, medals, and old photographs. But what mattered most were the stories. Children and grandchildren sat listening as their elders described the cold Atlantic, the fear, and the warmth that followed. They were tales of courage, yes, but also of humility. One American veteran, his voice cracked with age, summed it up during one of those gatherings. "We thought we were fighting for our countries," he said. "Maybe we were. But that night, we were fighting for something bigger, the right to still call ourselves human." His words were met with a long, quiet applause. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed, the museum curator walked alone through the submarine's narrow corridors. The air was cool and still. He paused in the control room, where the metal dials and gauges gleamed faintly under the lights. On the bulkhead was a small inscription that a visitor had once carved discreetly years ago. It read, "Mercy remembers what war forgets." The curator ran his fingers over the letters, smiling softly. No one knew who had written it, but it belonged there, as much a part of the submarine's story as its torpedoes and engines. The story endured not because it was spectacular, but because it was simple. It reminded everyone who heard it that humanity is not erased by conflict. It's revealed by how we respond to it. The Atlantic would always be a place of loss, filled with wrecks and ghosts, but also with echoes of mercy. And for as long as men told the story of that night, the sea would never seem quite as cold. The wind that swept over the Atlantic seemed unchanged through the decades, whispering the same low chant against the waves that had once carried the destroyer and the dying U-boat. Even as new ships crossed those waters, sleek and driven by technology unimaginable in 1944, there was a certain reverence when their captains plotted a course through that old stretch of sea. They knew it only from charts and training manuals, but older sailors would sometimes mark it quietly with a nod, as though acknowledging something sacred beneath the surface. It was the place where duty and mercy had collided, and mercy had won. Long before radar and satellite maps, the ocean had been humanity's most honest mirror. It showed people who they were when stripped of borders and flags. Captain Harland had understood that instinctively. "The sea," he had once written in a letter to his daughter, "asks no questions about allegiance. It only asks whether you will keep another from drowning." That letter remained tucked inside a family album, its paper yellowed, its message timeless. Generations later, it would be read aloud at Harland's great-grandson's naval commissioning ceremony. When the young officer finished, the crowd fell silent. For a moment, it was as though the old captain himself had spoken again through the wind. In Germany, the Fischer family kept their own relics. Karl's youngest son, now gray-haired himself, maintained his father's journal and notebook. The small, battered book contained sketches of the submarine, verses of poetry written in cramped handwriting, and a few lines that no one in the family ever forgot. They saved us not because we deserved it, but because they refused to be like those who had forgotten mercy. Those words became something of a creed in the family. Whenever hardship struck, they repeated it like a prayer. "Refuse to forget mercy," they would say, as if invoking their ancestors' rescue. When historians later pieced together the records, they found something remarkable. Neither side had ever exaggerated the event. There was no boastfulness, no dramatization. The Americans spoke of it simply as a duty fulfilled. The Germans described it as a miracle they hadn't expected. The absence of pride, the humility in both accounts, gave the story its strength. It was as though both sides agreed, wordlessly, that the moment had belonged not to them, but to the sea itself. In 2010, a documentary filmmaker sought to capture that shared humility. She spent months interviewing surviving family members, archivists, and naval officers from both nations. When the film premiered, it carried the title, "The Sea Remembers." The opening scene was stark, a calm horizon fading into dusk. a voiceover reading Harlan's words. "We fought them. We beat them. But we will never stop being sailors." Then old footage of U-boats surfaced through grainy waves, followed by interviews with aging veterans whose eyes still shone with memory. It wasn't a story of strategy or triumph. It was a meditation on empathy. The documentary won awards, but what mattered more was how many people said afterward that it had made them believe, even briefly, in the possibility of grace during war. One of the viewers, a young naval cadet from Norway, wrote in his diary that the film had changed how he viewed his profession. "They taught us about courage and command," he wrote, "but not about compassion. Now I understand that they are the same thing." His entry later circulated online and became a rallying quote for a new generation of officers across NATO schools, proof that the story's spirit had crossed even more boundaries than the two captains could have imagined. At sea, tradition thrives on repetition. Each year, during joint exercises between Allied navies, one ship is chosen to perform the Honor Salute, a brief ceremony remembering those lost to the ocean. On certain years, the chosen coordinates are the same ones where U-870 went down. The crew stands at attention as a bell tolls, and an officer recites a brief passage adapted from both Harlan's and Fisher's words. "We remember not only the fallen, but the forgiven." A wreath of white flowers is cast into the water, and for a few quiet minutes, the engines idle while the waves close over it. Young sailors, many barely old enough to grasp the scale of the war, feel something stir within them, not guilt or pride, but respect. There were other echoes, too, smaller but just as meaningful. In a coastal village near Hamburg, a local maritime school painted a mural of two hands reaching across a wave, one bearing an American flag patch, the other a tattered German sleeve. Beneath it were the words, "Das Meer vergisst nicht," the sea does not forget. Fishermen passing by in the early morning mist would touch the wall before heading to work, murmuring small wishes for calm weather and safe passage. To them, the story was not about war at all. It was about what the sea demands of anyone who makes a life upon it. When Fisher's grandson, the naval engineer, eventually retired, he returned to the Atlantic for one last voyage. It was a memorial cruise organized for veterans' families, tracing the convoy routes from the war years. On the second evening, the ship entered the coordinates where his grandfather's submarine had been forced to the surface. The captain announced over the loudspeaker that they would hold a brief remembrance. The passengers gathered on deck, wrapped in coats against the wind. The sky was streaked with crimson and gold, the water calm as glass. The grandson stepped forward to speak. His voice trembled slightly, but he spoke with quiet conviction. "My grandfather told me that when he saw the American destroyer's lights that night, he thought he was seeing the end of the world. But what he really saw was the beginning of a different one. The men who pulled him from the sea did more than save his life. They saved his faith in humanity." He paused, gazing out over the horizon. The sea is big enough for all of us. It has no borders. Maybe that's why it remembers mercy, because mercy too has no borders. When he finished, the passengers lowered a small wreath into the water. It drifted away, caught in the soft glow of the sunset, until it disappeared into the widening dark. No one spoke for a long time. The only sound was the steady rhythm of the waves, the same rhythm that had once carried gunfire and now carried peace. In the years that followed, the story continued to surface whenever people spoke of decency in wartime. It became an emblem, not just for navies, but for humanitarian groups and educators. Its message transcended uniforms and flags. A few words from Harlan's diary, engraved in stone at the base of the U-505 exhibit, came to symbolize its enduring power. Compassion is the anchor that keeps us from drifting too far from who we are. Visitors often paused before those words, perhaps unsure why they felt such weight in them, yet somehow changed as they walked away. The Atlantic, vast and endless, remains the keeper of countless secrets. But this one, the story of two captains who chose mercy over malice, refuses to sink. It rises with every telling, every echo of wind and wave, a quiet reminder that even in the coldest waters, humanity can still float. In the years that followed, as the world moved further away from the shadow of the Second World War, the story of the captured U-boat became something more than a tale of survival. It evolved into a parable, quietly told wherever people spoke about the thin line between duty and compassion. Governments changed, alliances shifted, new weapons replaced the old, but the ocean remained constant, its deep gray silence still carrying the memory of that single act of mercy. In both Germany and the United States, the story found a home in classrooms and military academies. It wasn't part of the official curriculum, but teachers and instructors who understood its significance kept it alive. In lectures about naval ethics, young officers listened to accounts of Captain Harland and the crew of the U-870, their rescue, and the remarkable dignity with which both sides conducted themselves afterward. One instructor at Annapolis began his course each year with the same sentence: "War will test what kind of person you are, not just when you're shooting, but when you stop." Then he would tell the story of the rescue, the coffee, the blankets, the quiet nods between men who were supposed to hate each other but couldn't bring themselves to. The lesson was simple, yet profound. Humanity is not suspended in war. It's proven there. And every generation that heard the story seemed to find new meaning in it, adapting it to their own time, their own conflicts. For some, it was about leadership. For others, about forgiveness. But for everyone, it was about the choice to remain human when everything around you demanded otherwise. In the German Navy, similar lessons were drawn. At a memorial service in Kiel for lost submariners, an admiral spoke of the captured crew of U-870. They went to sea believing their enemy was a monster, he said, and they were saved by a man who refused to act like one. That is not just history, that is our inheritance. The crowd, made up of young sailors in uniform and the gray-haired families of veterans, stood in solemn silence. A brass band played a slow hymn as the names of the lost submarines were read aloud. When U-870 was mentioned, a single bell rang, and one of the surviving crew members, an old man now, his hand trembling, placed a small wooden carving of a seagull beside the memorial. On its wings he had etched a single word: Dankbarkeit, gratitude. Even outside of naval circles, the story resonated deeply. Writers, poets, and artists found themselves drawn to it, using it as a metaphor for reconciliation and the endurance of empathy. One painting displayed at a Berlin museum in 2018 depicted the moment of rescue, a cold blue sea under a stormy sky, with the faint light of the destroyer cutting through the darkness. In the water below, shadowy figures reached upward, while hands reached down from above. The title was simple: Still Men. The artist, the great-granddaughter of one of the rescued sailors, said she had painted it after reading her ancestor's diary. He wrote that when they pulled him from the water, he no longer saw an enemy's hand. He saw a human one. Back in Chicago, the U-505 exhibit continued to draw visitors from around the world. Its steel hull, once the silent predator of the Atlantic, now stood as a monument to something far greater than war. It stood for survival, honor, and the choice to be kind in the face of cruelty. Curators had long noticed that the part of the exhibit that drew the most emotion wasn't the display of weapons or machinery. It was a small glass case showing the personal effects of the captured crew: a worn cap, a notebook, a photograph of a mother, and a folded American handkerchief, the very one given to a German sailor by an American medic on the day of the capture. Next to it hung a short excerpt from a POW's post-war interview. They treated us as men, not as monsters. It was the first time I understood that war does not destroy humanity. People do, and sometimes people choose not to. Visitors often stood before that display for a long time, their reflections merging with the glass. Some wiped their eyes quietly, others placed small tokens, coins, poppies, folded notes, beneath the case before moving on. Among those who visited was a young historian named Rachel Harland, the great-granddaughter of Captain Harland. She had grown up hearing the story but wanted to experience the U-boat for herself. Walking through its narrow corridors, she felt both awe and unease. It was hard to believe that her ancestor had once stood above this very kind of machine, peering down at men who had just surrendered their fate to him. As she traced her hand along the cold metal, she whispered the words her great-grandfather had once written: "Because the sea takes enough lives." When she emerged from the submarine, she found herself standing beside one of the surviving German crewmen, now frail but sharp-eyed. He smiled when she introduced herself. "You are his blood," he said in a soft accent. "Your great-grandfather saved me." He extended his hand, the same simple gesture that had defined their meeting 8 decades before. I owe him my life. But more than that, I owe him my faith in people." She shook his hand, and in that moment, the long thread of history seemed to fold in on itself. War and peace, hatred and grace, all connected by that touch. Later, she would write a book about the encounter, not as a historian, but as a granddaughter, trying to understand the legacy of a man she had never met. In the introduction, she wrote, "We remember our ancestors for what they fought for. I choose to remember mine for what he stopped fighting for." The book became an unexpected success, translated into multiple languages, taught not just in military schools but in ethics classes, churches, and even peace negotiations. It reminded people that decency isn't weakness, it's strength uncorrupted by rage. Around the same time, an international naval summit was held in Norfolk, Virginia. Admirals from across the world gathered to discuss cooperation and peacekeeping missions. During one session, the chairman quoted from Harlan's journals, the same passage that had once been found by his daughter. "If we can rescue even one soul from the sea or from the darkness inside us, then maybe we've already won something greater than war." The hall fell silent. In that stillness, seasoned officers, men and women hardened by decades of service, felt a rare, shared humility. They knew the truth of those words. They had lived it in their own way. That night, at a private dinner, one admiral raised a toast. "To the men who remembered to be human," he said. Glasses clinked softly, and for a fleeting second it was as if the Atlantic's eternal whisper could be heard even there, thousands of miles away. Outside, the wind swept over the harbor, carrying the scent of salt and the faint echo of distant waves. Somewhere across the water, the spirit of the old destroyer and the sunken U-boat drifted together. No longer foes, no longer instruments of destruction, just two ships resting in the same endless sea that had once tested the hearts of men. By the mid-2020s, few of the men who had lived through that night were still alive, yet their story had taken on a life of its own, a living legend that stretched beyond the military world and into the collective memory of ordinary people. Each retelling, whether in documentaries, school lessons, or commemorative ceremonies, carried the same quiet heartbeat of the sea: mercy, dignity, humanity. And as the decades passed, that heartbeat seemed to grow louder, not fainter. In Germany, a foundation was established in the name of Karl Fischer, dedicated to promoting reconciliation through maritime history. It sponsored student exchanges between German and American naval academies, where young cadets visited each other's ships, learned about their shared past, and in solemn ceremonies, read aloud from the journals of both Harlan and Fischer. The most popular passage was one Karl had written during his internment as a POW. "I believed my enemies would hate me. Instead, they saved me. Perhaps hate is a choice we can unlearn." The foundation adopted that as its motto. During one such exchange program, a group of young cadets stood aboard a U.S. Navy destroyer as it cut through the Atlantic at sunrise. The sea was calm, glowing gold in the early light. One of the American officers pointed to the horizon and said, "That's where it happened, somewhere out there." The German students fell silent, looking out at the expanse that had once been a battlefield. A girl in the group whispered, "It's strange, isn't it? The ocean doesn't keep scars." The officer smiled. "No," he said, "but people do. And sometimes they turn them into lessons." In Chicago, the U-505 exhibit received a renovation, including a new interactive display titled "The Day the War Stopped for an Hour." It allowed visitors to experience the story not through statistics or dates, but through personal testimony, voices of the sailors themselves recorded or recreated from diaries and interviews. Visitors would hear the hum of the destroyer's engines, the panic of the U-boat crew surfacing, and then the soft voice of the American captain saying, "Get them out of the water." At the end of the exhibit, a simple question appeared on the screen. What would you have done? Teachers noticed that question lingered with students long after their field trip. Essays poured in, some from children who wrote about wanting to be brave like the captain, others who said they realized war wasn't just about fighting, but about choosing kindness. One essay, written by a 13-year-old, became part of the museum's permanent display. It read, "He didn't win a battle that day. He won something bigger. He proved the enemy could still be human." In a way, the museum had become a quiet temple of empathy. It wasn't loud or heroic, it was contemplative, peaceful, like standing inside the memory of a heartbeat. Veterans who visited often remarked that it was the only war exhibit that made them leave in silence, not in awe of victory, but in awe of decency. The ocean, too, seemed to play its part in remembering. In 2028, marine archaeologists discovered the remains of a U-boat off the coast of the Azores. It wasn't U-505 or U-870, but the find reignited global interest in submarine warfare and the men who had fought it. News outlets reported not just on the technology or artifacts, but on the stories, the human element that had too often been forgotten. One reporter concluded her article with a line that echoed through social media. "The sea does not take sides, but sometimes it teaches lessons." Beneath her post, readers shared the story of Captain Harland and Carl Fisher again, calling it the most hopeful war story ever told. That year, a naval composer wrote a symphonic piece titled Mercy on the Waves, inspired by the same events. The music began with a low, ominous rumble, sonar pings and drum beats mimicking the tension of depth charges, then slowly evolved into a soaring melody that felt like dawn breaking over a calm sea. The final movement featured a single trumpet echoing the sound of a distant ship's horn. The piece debuted at a joint American-German memorial concert in Washington, D.C., where both nations' naval bands performed together. At the end, as the music faded, the audience stood in silence, not clapping for nearly a full minute. Back in Germany, the Fisher Foundation created a scholarship for students studying maritime law, focusing on humanitarian conduct during war. Its guiding principle was carved into the marble wall of its headquarters. Even in conflict, you can choose to be kind. It became one of the most quoted mottos in naval education around the world. For Rachel Harland, the captain's great-granddaughter, the years following her book's success brought invitations to speak at conferences, memorials, and schools. Yet she often said that the most meaningful moment of her life came during a small, private trip to the North Atlantic. On the exact anniversary of the capture, she joined a handful of veterans' families aboard a research vessel. At twilight, as the ship slowed to a drift, she stood at the bow holding a letter, one her great-grandfather had written but never sent, found among his belongings decades after his death. It read, "I've seen men sink into darkness. I've seen others pull them out. Perhaps that's all life is, a series of rescues. Sometimes we save them from drowning. Sometimes we save them from hate. Either way, the hand is the same." She read those words aloud as the ship floated quietly, the ocean stretching endlessly around them. When she finished, she folded the letter and let it drift into the water. The wind caught it, lifting it just above the surface for a moment before it vanished into the waves. Someone behind her whispered, "He would have been proud." She nodded, tears glistening in the fading light. "So would Carl," she said softly. In that moment, it didn't matter who had been the victor or the vanquished. The war had ended long ago, but the legacy of that night, the rescue, the kindness, the humanity, had outlasted every battle and every empire. It had become a kind of eternal current flowing quietly beneath the surface of history. Decades later, historians would still write about the Battle of the Atlantic, about tonnage, tactics, losses, and victories. But somewhere in the middle of all those statistics, one footnote would always stand out. June 1944, an American task group rescues the entire crew of a sinking German submarine. All prisoners treated with honor. A simple line, perhaps, but behind it lived a universe of courage, compassion, and the unbreakable truth that even in war, decency is not defeated. It merely waits for the right heart to awaken it. And so the sea kept its secret, carrying it in the rhythm of its tides, whispering it in the crash of every wave. To those who listened closely, it was still there, the echo of a captain's voice on a cold night, long ago, saying, "Get them out of the water." The years rolled on, and as the last living veterans of that fateful night passed quietly into history, the story of the rescue began to take on a new shape, one not confined by war, but embraced by generations who saw it as proof that empathy could outlast violence. In classrooms, naval halls, and even on the internet, people shared the tale as an antidote to cynicism, a reminder that courage did not always wear medals or carry weapons. Sometimes courage was simply a hand reaching through cold water. At the U-505 exhibit in Chicago, now a global heritage site, The museum introduced a digital archive that allowed visitors to listen to audio dramatizations of the rescue. The voices were reconstructed from letters and testimonies, and the sequence ended with a reading of Captain Harlan's words. "We fought them. We beat them. But we will never stop being sailors." Even through speakers, his tone felt real, weary, proud, and filled with quiet conviction. Many visitors left the exhibit teary-eyed, not because of what had been lost, but because of what had been preserved. One afternoon, a group of schoolchildren from both America and Germany visited together as part of an exchange program. The guide, a retired sailor, told the story not like a lecturer, but like a grandfather recounting something sacred. He described the claustrophobic life inside a U-boat, the roar of depth charges, the shock of surrender, and then the silence of the sea when the Americans chose to save rather than destroy. When he reached the part about the sailors sharing coffee and blankets, a boy raised his hand. "Why did they help them?" he asked. The old man smiled gently. "Because they remembered that before they were enemies, they were men." The children nodded, not fully grasping the depth of the answer, but sensing its importance. As they left, several of them turned back to look at the submarine one last time, a relic of war that had somehow become a monument to peace. Across the ocean, in the port city of Kiel, a memorial was built in honor of all submariners who never returned. Unlike most war memorials, it featured no weapons, no flags, no mention of victory or defeat. Instead, it depicted two sailors standing side by side, gazing toward an invisible horizon. One wore the insignia of the Kriegsmarine, the other the U.S. Navy. Between them was a bronze plaque inscribed with words in both German and English. "The sea divides nations, but it unites men." At the memorial's unveiling, dignitaries from both countries attended. Among them was a naval historian who had spent her career studying the capture of U-505. When she was invited to speak, she said, "We often talk about the horrors of war because they are unforgettable. But perhaps we should also talk about its mercies, because they are even more rare." She looked at the statue, her voice softening. "These men fought under different flags, but when the ocean took their strength, they saw each other as equals. That is the lesson the sea gives us, and it is one the world must keep learning." The crowd applauded, but it was the quiet after the speech that seemed to carry the true weight of her words. An elderly German man, standing near the front, saluted the statue before leaving a single white rose at its base. When asked who he was, he replied, "My father was on that U-boat. He used to say the Americans didn't just pull him from the sea, they pulled him out of hate." That sentiment found its way into countless retellings, in books, articles, podcasts, even social media posts. It became a quote shared whenever people needed reminding that humanity was still capable of grace. They pulled him out of hate. 6 words that summed up everything Captain Harland and his men had done without ever intending to become heroes. In 2030, the United Nations hosted a global summit on maritime law and ethics, commemorating 100 years since the peak of the Battle of the Atlantic. During the opening ceremony, a short film was played chronicling the story of the U-boat's capture and the extraordinary conduct of its captors. The hall was silent as the footage rolled, archival clips of young sailors laughing, photographs of the captured Germans, the face of Harland staring into the distance. At the end, the screen faded to black, and a single line appeared: "Because the sea takes enough lives." The delegates stood and applauded, not as representatives of nations, but as people humbled by the simplicity of that truth. Outside the hall, a bronze sculpture of a hand reaching down toward another emerging from the waves was unveiled. It was titled, "The Rescue." Beneath it, an inscription read, "Dedicated to all who chose mercy when the world expected none." Visitors took photographs, and within hours, the image had spread across the world. For a time, that statue became a symbol on posters, campaigns, and memorials, not of war, but of humanity rediscovered. Even in the digital age, when history often feels distant and abstract, the story of Captain Harland and Carl Fisher retained a startling intimacy. Perhaps it was because it wasn't about politics or power, but about a moment of simple decency in chaos. A single moment that said, "This is what we could be if we remember who we are." On one stormy afternoon, Rachel Harland returned once more to the coast of Ireland, near where her ancestors' destroyer had patrolled. The wind was sharp, the horizon endless. She stood at the edge of the cliffs, the ocean roaring below. In her hands, she held a small brass compass, the same one Carl Fisher had sent to her great-grandfather's family decades before, engraved with the words, "To the man who showed me the way home." She knelt and placed it in a crevice between the rocks, letting the wind cover it slowly with sand and salt. "Stay here," she murmured. "You belong to the sea." As she rose, she thought about the irony of it all, that a war meant to divide the world had, through one small act, connected two families forever. She imagined the cold night of the rescue, the shouts, the lights, the water glimmering with fire and foam, and in the middle of it, her great-grandfather's voice shouting, "Pull them aboard." It was not just a command. It was a declaration of faith. Faith in decency, in the fragile but enduring belief that kindness was worth the risk. She turned from the sea and began walking back up the path, her coat whipping in the wind. Behind her, the ocean stretched endlessly, unbroken and eternal, carrying the memory of that night like a hidden current beneath its waves. For though time had erased nearly every trace of that war, the wrecks buried, the men gone, the nations changed, one thing remained. A lesson written not in ink or stone, but in the conscience of all who heard it, that mercy, once given, never truly sinks. Even as the 20th century slipped further into memory, the story of the captured U-boat continued to live in the quiet places where remembrance and gratitude meet. There were no parades for it, no fireworks, no political banners, only the steady persistence of a truth too simple to die. Somewhere out on the Atlantic, the coordinates of that long-ago rescue remained unmarked. Yet to sailors who crossed those waters, it was as real as any island. They knew that beneath those gray waves, history had paused for a heartbeat and remembered to be kind. In both nations, new generations began to rediscover the story, not as a relic of war, but as a parable for modern times. In a world growing faster, colder, and more divided, the quiet heroism of Captain Harland and the humanity of his crew felt like a beacon, proof that compassion was not weakness and decency not naivete. Schools began using the tale not in military history classes, but in lessons about ethics, diplomacy, and leadership. Students wrote essays asking what it meant to win if victory came at the cost of one's soul. One young student wrote, "The sea tested them, and they passed. The real war they won was inside themselves." Meanwhile, the descendants of both crews stayed in touch. Every few years, they met in alternating cities, sometimes in Chicago, sometimes in Hamburg, sometimes in London, to honor the men who had shown mercy when the world seemed incapable of it. These reunions were modest, a dinner, a few speeches, a moment of silence. But there was laughter, too, and stories shared across accents and generations. The grandchildren of sailors who once aimed guns at each other now shared toasts, jokes, and photographs of their families. One American man joked, "If our grandfathers could see us drinking beer together, they'd probably think we'd gone mad." A German woman smiled. "No," she said softly, "they'd be proud." At one such reunion, held aboard a restored Liberty ship anchored off Boston Harbor, a short ceremony took place on deck as the sun set over the water. The wind smelled of salt and rust. The descendants stood shoulder to shoulder while a Navy chaplain spoke. "The men we honor tonight," he said, "remind us that courage is not measured by how fiercely we fight, but by how fiercely we protect what makes us human." When the chaplain finished, the group cast small wooden ships, carved by schoolchildren, into the harbor. Each bore a single word burned into its deck: peace. They drifted together, then apart, glowing faintly in the twilight before the tide carried them away. The media covered the reunion briefly, but what captured public imagination was a photograph taken that evening. Two elderly men, one German, one American, holding hands as they looked out at the sea. Their faces were lined with age, yet there was a gentleness in their eyes that transcended time. The photograph went viral, shared across social media with captions like, "Enemies once, brothers now." It reminded people that history wasn't just something that happened, it was something that could still teach. Back at the U-505 exhibit, now fully digitized, visitors could explore the story in unprecedented detail. One feature allowed them to walk through the events of the capture using augmented reality, standing virtually on the deck of the destroyer as it approached the surfacing submarine. The experience ended not with gunfire, but with the moment the Americans threw down rope ladders to the Germans struggling in the water. On screen, as digital waves rolled beneath their feet, a quote appeared in white letters. Even the sea paused to watch. It was taken from an old sailor's recollection written decades after the war, when he had said that for the first time in years, he had felt peace, not because the enemy was defeated, but because mercy had been chosen. The story reached beyond navies now. Religious leaders cited it in sermons about forgiveness. Psychologists referenced it when discussing empathy under stress. Filmmakers began adapting it, not as a tale of combat, but as a meditation on choice. In one critically acclaimed film, the scene of the rescue was shot in total silence. The only sound was the wind and the creak of ropes as men were pulled from the water. No dialogue, no music, just the sound of mercy itself. The film won awards, but what mattered more were the letters it inspired. Veterans from other wars wrote to the director, thanking him for showing the quiet courage that exists even in chaos. "You reminded us," one wrote, "that not every act of war has to be an act of hate." Another letter from a young soldier deployed overseas read, "When I feel angry, I think about the captain who saved his enemies. He makes me want to be better than the world expects." Over time, the line between history and legend blurred, but the essence remained. People didn't always remember the names, Harland, Fisher, U-505, but they remembered the feeling. They remembered that somewhere in the darkest storm, someone had chosen light, and that choice, though small, had rippled outward for generations. In 2042, the centennial of the capture was commemorated with a joint ceremony on both sides of the Atlantic. In Chicago, naval officers, historians, and students gathered before the U-boat itself, while in Germany, at a naval base near Bremen, the same speeches were read aloud simultaneously. Technology linked the two sites in real time. Twin ceremonies, half a world apart, united by the same story. A large screen displayed the rolling Atlantic between them, its waves rendered live by satellite feed. As the ceremony reached its climax, both audiences joined in a moment of silence. Then, from Chicago, the American Admiral spoke, "To the men who remembered the sailor's code, who proved that mercy can be mightier than victory." In Germany, the crowd repeated the line in translation, their voices echoing faintly across the digital sea. The Admiral then recited Harlan's old words, "Because the sea takes enough lives." As the applause faded, the camera panned to the ocean, calm, endless, timeless. And for those few minutes, it felt as though the Atlantic itself was bearing witness again, as it had a century earlier. After the ceremony, news outlets around the world carried headlines not about warfare, but about kindness. "The night war stood still," one read. Another simply said, "A lesson the world still needs." For a brief, hopeful moment, the world seemed to agree. In a small apartment overlooking the North Sea, an elderly woman, Carl Fisher's granddaughter, watched the broadcast. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned up the volume. When the Admiral spoke the words, "They remembered the sailor's code," tears welled in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered to no one in particular. "They remembered." She looked out at the waves crashing against the shore and thought of her grandfather's stories, of the captain who had shown mercy, and of how that one decision had given her entire family a future. Outside, the wind carried the salt of the sea through her open window. It smelled of time, of memory, of something vast and forgiving. The ocean has no memory, they say. But perhaps that isn't true. Perhaps, somewhere deep beneath its surface, it remembers everything, the battles, the screams, the kindnesses. Perhaps it still holds that night, suspended in its depths, like a heartbeat that refuses to fade. And perhaps, when the waves crash gently against the hulls of passing ships, it is whispering the same message it whispered then. Be better than your hate. In the century that followed the end of the war, the Atlantic continued to move in its eternal rhythm, swallowing wrecks, reshaping coastlines, and carrying the weight of countless untold stories. Yet among all those stories, one remained curiously buoyant, as though it refused to sink. Sailors, scholars, and storytellers still spoke of the night when an American destroyer pulled German submariners from the freezing water, a night when mercy interrupted the machinery of death. To most people, that story was more than history. It had become a kind of moral compass, something to point to whenever the world seemed to forget itself. Newspapers and digital journals revisited it every few years, always finding new meaning. Commentators wrote essays with titles like The Sea That Forgave, or When Enemies Remembered Their Humanity. Some called it sentimental, even naive, but others, soldiers, sailors, survivors of other wars, defended it fiercely. They said it wasn't about romance or nostalgia. It was about the stubborn hope that decency might still be possible when all logic says it isn't. In 2050, a new museum opened on the German coast, dedicated not to military triumphs, but to reconciliation. Its central exhibit was titled Across the Water, and the story of Captain Harland and Carl Fisher took pride of place. Visitors entered a circular room surrounded by 360 degrees of projected ocean, vast, endless, rolling beneath a dark sky. Voices from both sides whispered around them, fragments of diaries, letters, and interviews. One voice said, "We thought they would kill us." Another, calm and steady, replied, "We thought we would have to." Then came silence, broken only by the sound of waves. In that silence, the visitors found themselves standing in the same suspended moment that had once changed everything. The museum's most moving feature was a small bronze model of a destroyer towing an inflatable raft. On the deck stood two tiny figures, indistinguishable in uniform, yet unmistakably human. Children visiting the museum often knelt to peer at it closely. The curators had installed a small plaque beside it that read, "Sometimes the smallest ships carry the greatest cargo. Mercy." Outside the museum, the sea crashed against the breakwater, throwing up mist that sparkled like memory in the sun. People came not to mourn, but to understand, to see how even the coldest wars could leave behind warmth if someone, somewhere, chose compassion. The legacy of that choice reached into unexpected places. In 2053, during a naval crisis off the Pacific, two opposing ships, one American, one from another nation, found themselves in a standoff after an accident at sea. A fire broke out aboard one vessel, and its crew was forced into the water. Despite the tension, the captain of the American ship ordered a rescue. Later, when questioned by officials, he quoted Captain Harland almost word for word. "We fought them, we beat them, but we will never stop being sailors." The media replayed that line for weeks. Commentators called it Harland's echo. Even after 80 years, his words still had power enough to diffuse anger. The story began to enter the realm of myth, the way certain truths always do. Some sailors said the sea itself rewarded mercy, that those who saved others, friend or foe, would always find calmer waters. Others spoke of Harland's light, a faint glow said to appear on the horizon during calm nights, guiding ships through fog. Rational minds dismissed such tales, but even they admitted that the ocean sometimes seems to remember the good we do upon it. In Chicago, the WWII exhibit had been rebuilt yet again, this time as a hybrid of history and art. Visitors could walk through both the submarine and a virtual reconstruction of the American destroyer, seeing the battle from both perspectives, first hunted, then rescuer. At the end, a single line appeared on a glass panel illuminated from within. "Hatred drowns quickly. Kindness floats." No one knew who first said it, but the sentiment felt right. Rachel Harland's book, long since considered a classic, had gone through dozens of editions. In her final years, she added an afterword reflecting on what the story meant in her own life. "People ask why my great-grandfather showed mercy," she wrote, "but perhaps the better question is why it still surprises us that he did. Maybe the miracle isn't that he was kind. Maybe it's that we still find kindness miraculous." Those words were etched into her gravestone when she passed, and mourners from around the world, sailors, historians, students, sent flowers. On the centennial of the end of World War II, a massive international fleet gathered for a commemorative voyage across the Atlantic. Ships from dozens of nations sailed side by side, their flags fluttering in the wind. They called it the Convoy of Peace. As they crossed the coordinates where the rescue had taken place, every ship slowed to a crawl. Sirens fell silent, engines idled, and from every deck, Thousands of sailors stood in stillness as a single bell tolled across the water. The sound carried for miles. To some, it seemed the ocean itself was echoing the note, a low, mournful hum rising from its depths. Then, as if on cue, sunlight broke through the clouds, scattering across the waves in a shimmer of gold. The moment felt almost sacred. The admiral of the lead ship, a descendant of one of Harlan's crew, stepped forward and cast a wreath into the sea. It was made of intertwined ropes, half blue, half gray. To the sailors of both flags, he said quietly, who remembered that the sea belongs to no one, and mercy to everyone. Applause was forbidden during the ceremony. Instead, there was only the rhythmic slap of water against hulls and the sigh of wind through the rigging. Somewhere in that vast silence, the past and present seemed to merge. It no longer mattered who had worn which uniform, who had won or lost. What mattered was that for a few precious hours in 1944, men had chosen to be good when they had every reason not to be. Afterward, a journalist covering the event wrote in her column, "We live in an age of machines, but what endures are the moments when humans act like humans. The sea forgives." So should we. Her article was shared millions of times. Veterans associations used it as their official statement that year. Schools printed it for their students. Once again, the message spread, not through politics or propaganda, but through shared belief. In a way, the ocean had become a messenger, carrying that belief across generations. Long after the last witness was gone, long after the last photograph had faded, the tide still moved, tireless, eternal, whispering through the foam and the wind. Remember, for there is a kind of immortality that does not depend on monuments or medals. It lives in the choices we make when no one is watching. Captain Harlan's name might someday be forgotten, the U-boat's number might vanish from textbooks, but the act itself, the refusal to abandon one's humanity, will remain like a light deep under the waves that no darkness can touch. And perhaps on a quiet night, when the sea is calm and the stars hang low, if one listens closely enough, they might still hear the echo, not of gunfire, not of engines, but of a voice calling out across the wind, "Pull them aboard." As the world drifted deeper into the 21st century, the sea remained the same, vast, ancient, and impartial. Nations rose and fell, new conflicts flickered across headlines, and technologies reshaped how humanity traveled and fought. Yet across all those changes, the ocean continued to remind those who sailed it that mercy and courage were not opposites, but companions. And among the sailors who crossed the North Atlantic, the legend of the American Admiral and the German U-boat crew remained one of the most beloved stories ever told, not because it was spectacular, but because it was true. For generations, the story was retold in 1,000 different accents. Old fishermen in Ireland spoke of it when fog settled heavy on the water. Naval instructors used it as a moral compass during training exercises. In the cafes of Hamburg and the veterans' halls of Virginia, it came up in conversation whenever men spoke of the sea with respect rather than fear. There was something enduring about it, something that outlasted bitterness and outshone victory. People who had never seen war still found comfort in it. It wasn't about sides anymore. It was about choices. One autumn, a young filmmaker named Elias Fisher, the great-great-grandson of Carl Fisher, began work on a feature film inspired by the story. He had grown up with his family's version, passed down through quiet dinner-table recollections, but he wanted to show the world what his ancestors had really lived through. "It's not a war movie," he said in an interview. "It's a story about decency when it mattered least." Elias spent years collecting letters, visiting archives, and interviewing historians. He walked the deck of the preserved U-boat in Chicago, tracing the same metal his great-great-grandfather once touched. He sat in the Naval Archives in Washington reading Captain Harlan's logbook, his hands trembling slightly when he came across the words, "Rescued 42 survivors, all treated with the full honors of the sea." In those few sentences, Elias felt everything his film needed: simplicity, integrity, and grace. When the film finally premiered, it stunned audiences. There were no exaggerated explosions, no heroic speeches. The heart of the movie was silence. The silence after the depth charges stopped, the silence when the submarine surfaced, and the silence when the American captain looked down at the terrified German boys and gave a single order: Get them out of the water. The actor playing Harlan spoke those words barely above a whisper, yet the audience felt their weight. Critics called the film a masterpiece of restraint. One review read, "It's not a movie about war, it's a movie about what it means to remain human in war." Another said, "For 2 hours, we see what the world could be if mercy were contagious." The film swept international awards, but what moved Elias most wasn't the acclaim. It was the letters he received from veterans, soldiers, and ordinary people who had seen the story and felt changed by it. "You made me believe in decency again," one message read. "Thank you for reminding us that we always have a choice." At a post-screening Q&A, a student asked Elias whether he ever feared the story would lose relevance as time went on. He smiled and shook his head. "The sea will always exist," he said, "and as long as people fight, they'll need to be reminded how to stop fighting." Back in Chicago, the museum hosted a special exhibit honoring the film. They projected stills from the movie alongside photographs of the real men who had inspired it. Visitors moved between the images slowly, as if caught between past and present. The final room of the exhibit played the film's closing scene on loop, the moment when the rescued German sailors, wrapped in blankets, raised their hands in salute as the American destroyer turned toward home. The camera lingered on their faces, young, exhausted, and alive. The screen then faded to black, replaced by a single line of text: "Mercy is victory enough." That phrase began appearing everywhere, on naval posters, in classrooms, even in online forums dedicated to ethics and leadership. It wasn't just a slogan, it was a truth rediscovered. And in time, it came to define not just one story, but a philosophy. In Germany, naval academies began holding an annual lecture titled "The Honor of the Sea." The lecture explored moments in history where compassion had guided decisions, even amid conflict. Captain Harlan's name appeared alongside figures from many nations, men and women who had refused to surrender their humanity. Each year, a cadet was chosen to deliver a short reflection. One year, a young officer named Anna Fisher, a descendant of Karl's, stood before the audience and read from her ancestor's wartime diary. "He wrote," she said softly, "when they pulled me aboard, I thought it was the end. But when I saw their faces, I realized it was the beginning. I had been rescued not just from death, but from hate." She paused, her voice trembling slightly. "That's why this story matters," she continued, "because we all carry some version of that hate in us. And every time we choose compassion, we rescue ourselves a little bit more." The hall erupted in quiet applause, not the loud kind of celebration, but the respectful kind that carries gratitude in it. Across the ocean, the United States Navy renamed one of its humanitarian supply ships in honor of Captain Harlan. The USS Harlan became known not for combat, but for delivering aid in the wake of disasters: hurricanes, earthquakes, floods. On its hull, beneath the Navy insignia, was a small inscription: "Because the sea takes enough lives." Every sailor who served aboard knew the story behind those words. When they pulled survivors from wreckage or delivered food to storm-ravaged coasts, they felt they were continuing the same mission, proving that strength and kindness were not opposites, but extensions of each other. One stormy night in the South Pacific, decades after the ship's commissioning, a young sailor aboard the Harlan helped rescue fishermen from an overturned boat. Later, as he wrapped a blanket around one of the trembling survivors, the fisherman asked through an interpreter why they had come back into such dangerous seas to help. The sailor smiled and answered simply, "Because that's what we do. We pull people from the water." The interpreter translated, and the fisherman nodded slowly, tears in his eyes. The young sailor didn't know the full history behind those words. He only knew that they felt right. But somewhere deep in the ocean's memory, that act of mercy was recorded, another ripple in the long echo of Harlan's voice. As the decades stretched into centuries, the details of the Second World War began to fade from living memory. But the story of that single night endured, not as a tale of nations, but as a parable of the human spirit. Historians came to call it the Night of the Rescue, and poets, priests, and philosophers found endless ways to describe its meaning. Some said it was proof that morality could exist without reward. Others called it the heartbeat beneath the ocean. But most people just called it what it truly was: a story of decency. And as the tides continued to rise and fall, the sea kept whispering the same message that had carried through the generations. Mercy remembers what war forgets. In the centuries that followed, long after the rust had eaten through the last wartime hull and the oceans had shifted their moods countless times, humanity still found ways to tell the story of that night. It was woven into the folklore of the sea itself, a legend told not with glory or tragedy, but with quiet reverence. Sailors from every nation spoke of it in different tongues, but the essence remained the same. Once, in the middle of a war that devoured compassion, a handful of men had remembered to be kind. There came a time when historians no longer spoke of the Battle of the Atlantic as a series of victories and losses. Instead, they referred to it as a crucible, the place where the human spirit was tested under unimaginable pressure. Among all its grim episodes, the story of Captain Harland and the rescued U-boat crew stood apart like a clear light seen through fog. It had become, over generations, a symbol of what the sea demanded of those who dared to cross it. Not just courage, but conscience. In the far future, when naval academies taught their cadets about strategy and navigation, they also required a course called Ethics of the Sea. The first lesson always began with the same recording, a reconstructed voice of Harland saying, "We fought them, we beat them, but we will never stop being sailors." The cadets would sit in silence, hearing that line echoed through the speakers. Some of them would later say that it was that sentence, not the drills or simulations, that made them understand what their uniform truly meant. On the anniversary of the rescue's bicentennial, a massive holographic commemoration was held in the middle of the Atlantic itself. Ships from dozens of nations, now powered by silent, clean energy, formed a vast ring at the coordinates where the event had taken place 200 years before. Floating drones projected light into the mist, recreating the silhouettes of the American destroyer and the surfacing U-boat. No words were spoken. No national anthems played. The only sound was the deep hum of the sea. Then, from one of the lead vessels, a voice recited the line that had carried across centuries, "Because the sea takes enough lives." The holograms flickered, showing the scene of the rescue, not as propaganda, but as living memory. The lights faded, and the assembled ships shone their beacons upward, merging into a single column of white radiance that pierced the clouds. The light could be seen from orbit, a reminder to the world, and perhaps to whatever might exist beyond it, that compassion was still part of the human vocabulary. On that night, in homes across continents, people tuned in to the live broadcast. Children asked their parents why everyone was gathered in the ocean. "To remember," came the simple answer. Some children fell asleep before the ceremony ended, the sound of waves murmuring through the speakers. Others stayed awake, staring at the glowing column of light on their screens, sensing, even without understanding, that they were witnessing something sacred. Among the viewers was an old man who had spent his youth as a sailor. He sat in his chair by the window, watching the broadcast in silence. On his lap rested a small, weathered compass, an heirloom said to have belonged to one of the rescued U-boat crew. As the ceremony's final image appeared, two hands reaching across the waves, he whispered, "Still floating." His granddaughter sitting beside him asked what he meant. He smiled faintly. "The kindness," he said. "It never sank." That phrase became the title of a new anthology of essays and stories inspired by the rescue. It Never Sank became a global bestseller, translated into dozens of languages. Writers, philosophers, and even scientists contributed their reflections, connecting the act of mercy to everything from environmental ethics to space exploration. One essay drew a parallel between Harland's decision and humanity's responsibility to treat new worlds, and each other, with respect. "Every ocean is new to someone," it read. "Let us remember the first lesson of the old one. Mercy first." Meanwhile, at the site of the old U-505 exhibit, a new museum rose, not of steel, but of light. It contained no physical artifacts, only holographic projections and soundscapes that allowed visitors to step inside the moment. Standing in the immersive display, they could see both perspectives. The American crew lowering ropes into the freezing waves, and the German sailors struggling to climb aboard. As the scene unfolded, the narration whispered softly around them. They expected rage, but found respect. Visitors often left the museum in silence, unwilling to break the spell too soon. Generations changed, but the message endured. Whenever storms threatened coasts or nations teetered on the brink of conflict, people invoked the story as proof that mercy was always possible. Political leaders quoted Harland in speeches. Humanitarian missions named their ships after him. Even in fiction, the story found echoes: space captains saving enemy crews, explorers sharing oxygen on hostile worlds, scientists rescuing rivals in peril. Each new version was a mirror of the original, refracted through time but faithful in spirit. Eventually, scholars began to say that Harland and Fisher had become mythic archetypes: the warrior and the witness, the two sides of humanity that must coexist for civilization to survive. They argued that the rescue was less an event than an eternal reminder that in every era we are tested not by our enemies, but by our response to them. Yet even amid this grand mythology, the core of the story remained beautifully small. It was still about a handful of men on a dark ocean, pulling strangers from freezing water. The power of it lay not in scale, but in simplicity. That was the secret of why it endured, because it wasn't about perfect heroes or extraordinary miracles. It was about ordinary men, tired and frightened, choosing not to let cruelty be their legacy. On quiet nights, some sailors still left offerings at sea: a single candle, a floating wreath, or a whisper into the wind. They did it not out of superstition, but out of gratitude for the reminder that beneath all uniforms and histories, they shared the same fragile heartbeat. And the ocean, as always, listened. It rolled and sighed and shimmered, endless and patient, carrying the story forward to whoever would hear it next. For mercy, like the tide, always returns. In the far horizon of history, when nations had long since rewritten their borders and the wars of the past existed only as data in vast digital archives, the sea still held its own truths. It remained unowned, untamed, and eternal, the same dark mirror that had once reflected the flickering lights of a destroyer and a dying submarine. But even as the details of that night dissolved into legend, its meaning endured, rippling through time like the faint echo of a wave that refuses to break. By then, the ocean itself was monitored by satellites and sensors, capable of predicting storms, measuring currents, and tracking every vessel that crossed its surface. Yet, for all that technology, there was one thing: it could not calculate the weight of mercy. No algorithm could measure how one act of compassion could alter the moral tide of the world. And so, even in an age of machines, the story of Captain Harland and the rescued U-boat crew remained a touchstone, a calibration of the human soul. Students of maritime history studied it not as a tactical case, but as a moral equation. He could have chosen vengeance, they would say, but he chose rescue. Entire lectures were devoted to the psychological aftermath, how mercy affects both the giver and the receiver. And across those lessons, one idea surfaced again and again: that empathy, once shown, has no expiration date. It carries forward, handed down like a compass that always points true. On the bicentennial of Harland's birth, a quiet gathering took place on the shore near where his family once lived. There was no grand ceremony, no military parade. Only a handful of sailors, historians, and descendants came together to honor a man whose name had long transcended rank or nationality. They stood at the edge of the water as dusk fell, the horizon glowing faintly gold. A young officer read aloud from Harland's last known letter, written to his wife after the war. "We are taught that duty demands hardness, but I have learned that the sea punishes pride, not pity. On that night, I did only what the ocean itself would have done. I returned what it could not keep." When the officer finished, no one spoke. The waves lapped softly at their boots, and for a moment it felt as though the sea itself were acknowledging the words. Then one of the older sailors stepped forward and placed a small lantern on the surface. It floated gently away, its reflection trembling on the water. Within minutes, others followed. Lantern after lantern, hundreds of tiny flames drifting out to sea, like memories refusing to die. As night deepened, the sky filled with stars, and it became difficult to tell where the lanterns ended and the constellations began. Perhaps that was fitting. After all, the story had always belonged to both the sea and the heavens, to the places beyond reach, where human decency shines brightest against the dark. Somewhere, miles offshore, one of the lanterns caught a current and began to spin lazily, its light flickering before it finally went out. But the others kept floating, their glow growing softer, merging with the shimmer of moonlight. To those watching from the shore, It looked as if the ocean itself had decided to keep the lights alive. In time, those lanterns became a ritual. Every year, on the same night, sailors and civilians alike would release their own lights into the sea, not only in memory of Harland or Fisher, but for all who had chosen compassion when cruelty was easier. They called it the Night of Lanterns, though most simply knew it as the night we remember who we are. Children grew up hearing the story not as a lesson about war, but as a fable about choice. Teachers told them there are storms in every life, but there's always a rope to throw and a hand to hold it. Some of those children would grow into captains, explorers, or even peacekeepers. Others would never set foot on a ship, but all of them carried the same quiet inheritance, the understanding that the truest victories are invisible. One day, far in the future, when even Earth's oceans were no longer the only ones humanity sailed upon, a starship named the Harland departed orbit for an interstellar mission. On its bridge hung an old brass compass, preserved under glass. Its engraving had worn thin, but the words were still legible. To the man who showed me the way home. The crew, a mix of nations and generations, knew the story well. On the anniversary of the rescue, they dimmed the lights of the ship, gathered by the observation windows, and released a cloud of small bioluminescent drones into space. The glowing orbs drifted into the darkness like floating candles, a new kind of lantern sea. Someone whispered, "Still floating," and the others nodded. Even among the stars, the echo endured. Back on Earth, waves continued to strike the same old shores, whispering in languages older than memory. Somewhere deep beneath them, the wreck of the German U-boat still rested, blanketed in silt and silence. Nature had claimed it, coral and seaweed wrapping it in strange beauty. Yet divers who ventured there swore that the sight felt peaceful, not haunted, but blessed. They left offerings sometimes, a flower encased in resin, a folded flag, a carved word, Danka. It was as though even the sea understood what had happened there and refused to let it be forgotten. And so, in every telling, in every age, the story began the same way, with cold water and fear, and ended the same way too, with hands reaching through darkness. That simple act remained the truest definition of courage humanity had ever known, because when all else is stripped away, the medals, the ranks, the nations, the wars, what remains is this: a choice made in the cold, a rope cast across chaos, and the timeless belief that no life should be left to drown. For the sea takes enough lives, it always has. But once, just once, humanity refused to let it take one more. And that made all the difference, all the